the welfare state removes the penalties of failure, because what it effectively says to you, if you don't, in every way, if you don't look after yourself, don't worry, we'll pick up the pieces. The central rule of all human conduct should be actions and inactions have consequences. The moment you lose that sense, you are absolutely lost. And welfarism has removed that. I'm sorry, we need sticks as well as carrots. And the moment those go, and it applies on a high political level too. Why have politics in Scotland and Wales been so insane after devolution? Because you've given them large-scale political independence with no requirement that they pay for it, because it's paid for by the British taxpayer. So you can effectively have playpen politics. And what we've done is to introduce a playpen society. Everybody talks about infantilization. You know, this broad, the fact people grow up, if they ever grow up at all, much, much later than they used to. And it is effectively because you've removed risk. The state now acts as an overprotective parent, so you never grow up. I mean, growing up requires you take responsibility for yourself, and if you fall flat on your face, you pick yourself up, you wipe yourself off, you disinfect your wounds, and you sort yourself out. And doesn't it?
I couldn't agree with you more. The question I was going to ask you is, I think you and I both know that the central value of modern society has become this pathological empathy.
Yes. Compassion. Every time I hear the word compassion, I want to reach for my revolver.
Then what I'm hearing is David wants people to suffer, you know, the widow, the disabled man, the whatever, the child with whatever. And it just, I don't see how we're ever going to rebalance that, because nobody would want people starving to death.
No, nobody, and nor am I talking about that. What I was talking about was a world in which people recognize that provision for old age, provision for the widow, provision for the sick was something that you engaged yourself in consciously to provide for. That hence the fact there were saving clubs. Hence the fact there were local hospitals in which there was subscription. All of this sort of thing. Now, I'm not saying that we go back to that. That would be preposterous. But what we've done, all the great world of the first popular and large-scale popular interventions in politics in the later 18th century, if you look at what founding fathers of America, they are profoundly aware of the payoff between freedom and security. And remember, the classical framework is, if you trade freedom for security, you lose both. And that's exactly what we are doing, because the outcome of where we are now is Argentina. And Argentina has been lucky enough to get Milei. We are not all that far from Argentina. And we now have a government that is fully Peronist. The new Labour Party is fully Peronist and will bring about exactly the same consequences.
Well, when you say Peronist, most people don't know what that means. And I've heard you talk about the rule of lawyers and Keir Starmer being one. What do you mean when you say it's Peronist? What do you mean by when you talk about the rule of lawyers, and what does that mean for us going forward?
Well, again, I think the easiest way of describing it, by Peronism, we look at what happened to Argentina. Argentina was as rich as America in the late 19th century, a country of astonishing natural resources, which seemed a vast British investment, though it was never formal part of the British Empire. And then from the Second World War onwards, it embraces this perpetual statism, particularly under the rule of Perón and indeed Evita, in which the public sector gets bigger and bigger, there is more and more nationalization, there is more and more welfare, and what you do is again, it's something we can see going back upstairs, going back into the heavens. You can see repeatedly states get structures that are too big for their economies. That's what happens to the Roman Empire from 260 onwards. You develop there, it's the administrative and the military state and so on, and the tax base can't actually support it, so the state becomes self-consuming. And that's exactly what happened in Argentina, and or indeed it happened here in the 1970s. It's been manifestly happening here since the financial crisis, and the only way that the state can actually continue to pay itself without taxing itself to death is by vast inflation and the multiplication of the coinage. You suddenly create vast amounts of money. We called it something fancy, quantitative easing, but it's just as destructive of value, except it wasn't that it went straight into people's pockets, it went into property prices. Property prices haven't multiplied just because there are not enough houses. They've multiplied because vast sums of money were created by this disgustingly irresponsible thing called the Bank of England. And they find outlet somewhere. They find outlet in asset inflation, if not just ordinary inflation. And what we did under Blair, again in the 1970s, was to create...
1990s.
And yeah. What am I talking about? Forgive me, I said 70s. We created... Thatcher sorted... Right, let's go back. We fit this together because we've been doing well with the chronology. In the 1970s, Thatcher more or less sorted out the result of the problems that had been created by the first welfare state, the first nationalizations, the first excessive power to trade unions of that Labour government of 1945 to 51. But she did so at the risk of reducing conservatism simply to free market economics, which I think itself is also disastrous. Blair, as it were, deceives everybody, including he deceived Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher says in 1992 that Blair is her principal tribute act, that, she shows that she's won. But what she didn't realise, what Blair did was deliberately to transform the actual constitution of Britain. It is an extraordinary thing to say. You create a new kind of British state. In the same way, you totally distort what had been this Anglo-British identity and evaporate it of meaning. You create a new state. You replace the parliamentary legal state, which had run England in one form or another since Magna Carta, effectively since Magna Carta up to the 1990s. You replace it with this new, intense, centralized and extraordinarily, profoundly, dangerously structured thing that deliberately reduces the role of Parliament and therefore you and me, which is, again, like the German constitution, which was put together in the wake of Nazism, which was determined to make sure that you couldn't really have democracy doing anything too much. You deliberately reduce the power of Parliament. So we reduce it first by devolution, which produces this completely, crazily confused structure within the British Isles. Secondly, you incorporate the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, this is the problem again. We talk about woke a lot. What the left has done is to capture language. Human rights sound lovely. They're wonderful. Of course they are. But they've changed their meaning. The human rights that Eleanor Roosevelt was interested in were the human rights of every individual against the state. The original conventions were designed to stop Nazism, to stop communism. What happened instead is, through the influence of judges and through, above all, in the United Nations, the actual influence of Stalinism, you stand them on their head. Because human rights, and Lord Bingham actually says this absolutely explicitly in the 1990s, the real purpose of human rights is to protect minorities. Now, the moment you do that, you reverse, because the only way you can protect... Remember, there's a very simple definition of democracy. It's the rule of the majority. So you use human rights deliberately to destroy the democratic majority.